I'm working on this book at the moment, which is a rather a passion project and a sort of retrospective over a lot of the things just mentioned. So hopefully I've managed to corral a section of that makes sense for today's presentation. It is quite an ambitious scope, so here goes. So the context for what I'm going to talk about today is that we're living in a time of multiple crises, and everywhere there is talk of change. So in a political context, this call for action on a journey to a better future is not inevitably progressive. It might be a reactionary reversal of what went before, anti-incumbent, anti-establishment, shifting priorities that benefit some groups over others. For activists and grassroots social movements, on the other hand, pursuing a change agenda is more often attached to a vision of a forward dream, enacting possibilities. So this is where we get the link with sort of utopian practice. So values, but I would argue that only occasionally is this really an explicit theory of change that articulates how to respond to a crisis in a positive, progressive, sustainable way. Just quoting Schalk et al. In McGregor's Encyclopedia of Ecofeminism, crises created as a result of unsustainable capitalist patriarchal growth and its technologies cannot be solved and compensated for by more of the same. A central feature of this call for change is an ethics that privileges emotions, relationships, and experiences over impartial and rational moral reasoning. So this is the kind of change, this relational social architecture of change that I'm trying to explore here. People respond to unknown opportunities and threats in different ways, and they look to alternative and better futures through competing past and present identifications. Much of what we read and hear about climate change and sustained social inequality, for example, is deeply disempowering. Feeling powerless is a moral hazard, because knowing that we are doubtless part of the problem and not bearing the very worst of the consequences compounds this overwhelming feeling of climate anxiety, added to it with guilt, shame, and hopelessness. So this takes us back as a context for focusing on effective pursuit of change, how we deal with feeling anxious, whether on our own or jointly with others, is a key element of activism. In her book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, Sarah Jaquette Ray argues that some responses to crisis are natural but unhelpful because they take feelings of powerlessness that shape the way we behave in ways that can respond through paralysis or apolitical apathy, cognitive dissonance or denial, or the fight or flight hypervigilance. If the individual activist proceeds too fast from unexamined emotions to action in the heat of anxiety and a sense of imperative, feelings are not processed but instead pushed away or denied by the immediacy of the crisis. This model of activism, we can look around us, it's often associated with burnout. And the same is true of groups that operate through a kind of an unexamined response to emergency. So it's in this context that we can draw inspiration from an enduring history of people forming groups and imagining and pioneering competing visions of an alternative, better future. However, the tools, real and imagined, of collective responsibility and shared endeavour have been hollowed out by a culture and politics of material individualism. There is indeed, of course, compelling evidence that people yearn for connection with others and with nature. And this is many times the motivation for gathering together with others and imagining and realizing a dream of a better future. But in these contexts too, in the contemporary moment, maybe as compared to the historical examples we've been hearing about today, individualism puts a tremendous strain on us and our relationships. So there are many stories of ordinary people collectively imagining alternative possible futures, rooted in this yearning for community connectedness and a place of belonging, but there's a tendency, a high rate of failure, and we'll see this in terms of the very, very tiny minority of surviving and successful and thriving communities that I'm focusing on in my research. There's a tendency for these aspirations and hopes and dreams to remain hypothetical and futuristic. So as a scholar activist, my focus lies beyond largely theoretical work in utopian studies and prefigurative political scholarship. I'm interested in exploring the inner workings of actually existing intentional communities and communities organizing for change, which may or may not actually be intentional communities. They're more likely to be green movements. Whether their intentions are to win campaigns of social justice or to demonstrate more sustainable ways of living within the resources of one planet. To pursue a vision with purpose, groups need an effective theory of change and achievable campaigns, basically whether this is to reduce structural inequalities and leave fossil fuels in the ground, for example. So in this way, I share frustration with Deepak Bagara and Stephanie Luce. It is not sufficiently radical for utopian groups to imagine a better future if acting on this is limited to protest and demonstration. So this takes us to this, it's interesting that I'm working with the language here of the potential for change and transformation that lies in between the world as it is and the world as it should be. In utopian studies, this is more usually drawing on Ernst Bloch's idea of the not yet. But I prefer this in between because this realm is of possibility, and there is possibility for change, but this realm is fraught with tension and discomfort, and that tension has to be owned and engaged with. It's not sufficient to escape it to the world as it should be, because to do so is to miss the transformative power of, for instance, I mean, the cliche is the Martin Luther King idea of speaking truth to power. You have to be in that space of discomfort to do that. So it's a space of possibility, but it's also a space that doesn't actually get you rapidly to the utopian conclusion. Communities organizing in this space engage with institutions that are deeply invested in asymmetric power in the status quo. Boy, do we have examples of that at the moment. So this is why this space is going to be more important than ever in terms of being able to organize differently with conflict. This is another way of expressing what Eric Olin Wright refers to as a tension between dreams and practice, on the premise that what is pragmatically possible is not fixed independently of our imagination, but shaped by our visions and values. But fulfillment of any vision must be grounded in real potential to redesign social structures, including families, markets, property likes, and the like. So he draws that in terms of the Real Utopias project. And critical to this approach is a shift from individual to collective responsibility and purpose. So a lot of my work that I have over the years talked about as sort of social architectures or community glue or the hidden mechanisms by which groups maintain themselves and then act collectively must be, I must give credit to for in the foundational contributions of feminist theory and participatory planning, and participatory action research, because this is where thinking differently about the how and why of informal processes, often those which are that are informal in as much as they are not counted by the patriarchal capitalist system. So this is kind of Marion Mainwaring's idea of the whole economy and women's unpaid, unrecognised care work. These informal processes are the how and why that intentional communities connect rather than divide communities democratically. Not always progressive, but there's a mechanism here which does cultivate a sense of common ground in difference, or a common ground between individuals where you could say the sum is greater than the parts. There's something additional than an aggregation of individuals. So mission from conventional utopian studies is often a nuanced appreciation of this social architecture that mediates how people meet and interact and collaborate over time in different places. As Lyman Tower Sargent emphasises, there are so many different utopias, and that's partly because they are particular of their time and place. And that means there is no formula for this community glue. How people interact and collaborate over time through dialogue and interaction nurtures not only the visions about possible futures, but the strategies and plans needed to achieve them. And I call this the sort of task and maintenance functions of these group interactions and group governance structures, if you want to be more practical. So these feminist classics, which, I mean, I have been kind of celebrating as the grist for my work since late 1990s at LSE when I did my PhD, they push back against dehumanizing trends by reclaiming the social. And they can do so in housing, community, placemaking, but also, I think, in utopian studies. So, for instance, conventional housing designs make friendships more difficult. For neighborliness, we need proximity and interaction. For trust, mutuality, solidarity, sharing, and togetherness. Proximity, repeated and unplanned interactions in a setting that encourages people to let their guard down and confide in each other. It's quoting a quote from Bella De Paolo's book about living differently. But meaningful connections can't be engineered. And this is, I suppose, I'm getting close to what I understand about being intentional, particularly being intentional collectively. Architects can't be expected to know what constitutes the social from any textbook because the glue is intangible, informal, and often secret. The secret there is ironic because it's secret in the fact that the everyday that we take for granted is not counted by economists and politicians. It's secret to them, but it's completely and utterly habitually repeated in our everyday, particularly in terms of gendered norms and the dominant norms of what a family is and how a family should live. Success is not determined by quality or of materials or design alone. So just finishing this, too much text on the page here, but the two things I wanted to point out to here is that there has been an increasing awareness, for instance, on the idea of the social in placemaking, and attention's been drawn by policymakers to the likes of libraries and village halls where people meet and interact, and to structurally unequal socio-spatial distributions of hard and soft relational affective assets and capabilities. But I would argue that in the mainstream placemaking discourse, this lacks the drive to change the biases that are built into this. And that's why the final point is that we might need to unlearn the biases, particularly the biases around a culture of individualism. And, well, I'm going to move on from that. Okay, so this is why defining intentional communities, it's important to deconstruct what I mean by intentionality or being in the world intentionality, and contrast this with unintentional, involuntary, engineered and the like, although I think there'll be some interesting provocations between myself, my own work, and Linda's in this regard. Utopian studies and prefigurative scholarship acknowledges that intentional communities represent laboratories for testing and demonstrating new ideologies and social structures. However, by manifesting largely the worlds that we want, existing studies tend to gloss over incompletely negotiated and intangible qualities of mutuality and reciprocity. These are what bind people in groups and places to what being intentional is, what the social architecture this entails. Diane Leaf Christian, who herself lives in Twin Oaks, intentional community, and has written a lot about forming and living in intentional communities, refers to this as the community of glue, and it's quite often associated with shared meals, sitting down and eating food and the culture and practice of that. So the definition that I've stuck with adapted broadly from Bill Metcalfe's work, and he reprised it on a webinar recently, which I've distilled here. As a group of 5 or more people, drawn from more than one family or kinship group, who have voluntarily come together for the purpose of repairing or reinventing the perceived inadequacies of mainstream society. They seek to escape dominant norms, mostly individualism, materialism, by adopting a consciously devised and usually well thought out social and cultural alternative. In the pursuit of these goals, they share significant aspects of their lives together. Most definitions of intentional community focused on shared property to highlight that it takes more than trivial shared living arrangements, cooking and eating regularly together, for instance, to establish and maintain collectively negotiated intentions and a theory of change. Participants are characterized by we thinking, collective thinking, and social architectures that bring them together, seeing themselves as a continuing group, separate from and in many ways better, hence utopian methods, than the society for which they have emerged. Now, I don't, in my work, get especially bogged down with solving the argument of what community is or means, or indeed to police the boundaries of what constitutes a myriad definitions, and particularly of types of intentional community, which I'll go on to just illustrate in a moment. Instead, I want to draw attention to the parallel attributes of negotiated intentionality, these ideas of task and well-being functions. The task function refers to the work and activities that the group undertakes to fulfill their purpose, to share resources, to live lightly on the planet. The well-being function requires advanced social learning. Elsewhere, this is learning how to live differently. So elsewhere, this has been explored with respect to a 4-in-1 analysis to emphasize the effective dimensions of group processes that open up spaces of learning, feeling, being, and doing. So I said that there are widely reported types of intentional community, but my own research tends to work really only in what are the top of 3 categories here. I'm focusing on the sort of pragmatic, largely intergenerational, new forms of communalism or communality. I think a lot of utopian studies probably linger more extensively on religious, ideological forms of intentional community, which are to various extents quite exclusive, and then also idiosyncratic or variations on the themes above. So rather than getting bogged down on the complexities of lists, where even within this list, an eco-village or a co-housing or a cooperative can be delivered through any combination of these things. So you can have a cooperative socio-legal structure for an eco-village, and a cooperative itself could be a labour market cooperative or a housing cooperative, or it can be a form of community land trust. Rather than getting bogged down into all the sort of typologies of these, I think it's more useful to visualize intersecting variables on a continuum of radical to mainstream. And also to consider a continuum of pragmatism to distinguish qualities of organizing and relationship development that signal intentionality and effective change. So in other words, is the intentional community an intentional community to share a vision and stop at that? Or is the intentionality to agitate and organize to make change, however much on a parochial or small level, whether or not that scale of change can be scaled up? Interestingly, Stephanie was talking about the issue of scale earlier on. So just conscious of time, so just to give you a little bit of a sense of what this might look like, and to pick from starting from like late 19th century, very close to me in North Tyneside was a very interesting historical curiosity at Clowesdon Hill, 1895, a community that only lasted about 3 years, and it shows the very high failure rate of intentional communities, which actually were very much in the an anarchist community tradition. So there's a very long history, a UK history of communalism that dates back to the 16th and 17th century, particularly those that followed the kind of the levelers and the diggers and dreamers tradition, and that's why the community's encyclopedia and organisation supporting intentional communities in the UK today takes its name from this, called Diggers and Dreamers. It's an advocacy network. So that was the social architectures was the dreaming, and the task were the digging of the land. Clausen Hill was of this kind of late 19th century tradition. It existed briefly, inspired by the Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin, and the founders, Franz Kappa and William Key, took over a 12-acre farm, and they basically, they sort of bought it as a sort of experiment that then was under collective ownership and democratic control. So it wasn't actually communally invested in or owned in a sort of how we might see crowdfunding today. So in some ways it was already a slightly kind of hierarchical experiment by two people who had the resources to buy this farm. The experiment failed in part because it attracted mostly young men, not families, and because of a lack of capital and internal disagreements. And internal disagreements, the lack of the nurturing the kind of well-being functions of group togetherness is actually, a very source of the very high failure rate of intentional communities in the 20th and 21st century. So that's a kind of a UK example, but just to explain that the idea of kind of pushing intentional communities to shift towards a more pragmatic utopian vision, to acknowledge the tools of conviviality that Ivan Illich talked about in his book of that name, it's not a new thing. In fact, the idea of pragmatism has ebbed and flowed over the time. And this is shown in the this quote here from 1998 from the Journal of Cooperative Living Fellowship of Intentional Communities. It's now become the Federation of Intentional Communities. Jeff Grossberg wrote a guest editorial for this magazine that proposed a pragmatic way of intentional communities achieving the vision and values that they dreamt of. So not just living with the dream, but actually developing a theory of change to realize it. And he argued that they needed to align to an extent with the ways of the world. It was kind of like you have to dance with the devil. Communitarians have many dreams, large and small, to change the way we live and to change the world. But at times, our own attitudes and concepts are the most difficult obstacles to manifesting our visions. While we have beautiful dreams of what could be, we often struggle to find the resources and skills to materialize them. This is mostly because we're suspicious of the manipulative methods of corporate culture, the ways of the world. How do we become practical and effective at carrying out our work and yet stay true to our ideals? Ultimately, the ways of the world, the tools of mainstream culture, are not our enemies. It is how we choose to use them that determines their value. The process itself becomes a tool for transformation and growth. The means are every bit as important as the ends. Learning ways to get things done in the world while staying true to our ideals is itself a way to create a better world. If we can envision a better way of living for ourselves and for the world, then we have some responsibility for bringing it into being. Yet, even that responsibility can become a gift, for in reaching to manifest our dreams, we stretch and grow ourselves. So here, Jeff Grossberg, I think, is really interestingly alluding to this task and well-being function of intentionality, or negotiated intentionality in a collective. The fact that there's a sense of there has to be a collective journey of social learning, and individuals grow themselves in this process. But this process isn't just some gratuitous personal growth or a kind of a collective dreaming. It is actually galvanizing strategies for realizing, achieving the change that is part of the vision and values of that group. And I think, we can think of contemporary contexts where these skills and this group collective organising is going to be so very important to as a bulwark against totalitarianism in our present day and all the things that are going on around the world. And then up to a much more contemporary moment, and just to give you another maybe more prosaic example, Duma in Dumais in Eugene, Oregon, is a pragmatic utopian model of low-impact communal living that began as a vision shared by several students. Eugene is a kind of university town in Oregon. They had an experience of living in student cooperatives in the late 1980s. So this is showing that there's a kind of identified again in much of utopian studies is the idea that some of the purposes of utopian practices are, among them is a demonstration effect. So there was a demonstration effect of living together as students of what was possible. And then they took that kind of learning of what it was like to actually live relatively temporarily as a student cooperative and then said, okay, so let's imagine something bigger than this. Let's identify a way of imagining as a group without property, establishing some common values, and then identifying a property to inhabit in a way that would be intentional. We have values of community, ecological responsibility, diversity, personal growth, and equality. So this core group bought a property that had been divided into apartments, and they restored it into a 10-bedroom house with shared amenities. So they had private spaces, but shared space is quite typical of many co-housing communities, of a workshop, laundry, large kitchen, pantry, guest room, and office. And to this day, the Dumais community continues sharing dinners together 5 nights a week, with one person cooking for everyone on a rotation basis. Again, very similar. So they're calling themselves a cooperative, an eco-cooperative. Doesn't really matter how they self-define, but these are very similar. This is a very similar characterization to a lot of the new forms of communalism that are emerging today in the form of co-housing, eco-villages, intentional communities of practice in the workplace and that. So dozens of people have lived at Dumais over the years. What's very interesting about this example is that they have an active program of guest workers, a bit like a willing workers on organic farms, which I myself have done in Australia, which is a way of kind of transmitting the lessons of intentional community for people who experience it and take that experience away with them. Going back to the days of the women's movement in the UK, we had the Greenham Common peace camps in Greenham Common. And there was a lot of writing afterwards by the women activists involved saying that the activists who were at the peace camp at that time took a part of Greenham with them into the rest of their lives. And that was a form of transmitting a kind of the demonstration and the seeds of utopian practice into other forms of activism in the everyday. Because it went from the everyday of cooking, childcare, doing things collectively, into more kind of prosaic and mundane realities of their lives after the Greenham peace camp closed. So according to this group, visitors often remark that we are neat, well organised and accountable to one another. Each person signs up for responsibilities on a job chart. We swap chores periodically to accommodate people's changing schedules and desire to learn new skills. With many people living under one roof, we can keep our home running smoothly with each person contributing just a few hours of work each week. So this is very practical. This is not a commune in terms of having a common purse. It's not... people have retained a degree of privacy, they retain outside employment and their own incomes, but there is a high level of kind of meeting around the practical and the everyday that actually transmits a kind of really quite alternative and potentially radical personal and collective journey of growth. And it is a kind of set of values that aligns very closely with socio-political movements of sustainable degrowth, what it takes to actually live with reduced resources, reduced spatial requirements, reduced transport requirements. They keep chickens, they have a vegetable garden, they have fruit trees, they share their vision to the wider world through education programs. So this is tiny space that actually has quite an amplified potential theory of change. But and it's interesting, I've been thinking about this just today, hearing some of the other talks that theories of diffusion are often used when identifying or explaining why contemporary intentional communities remain a very tiny proportion of the population. I mentioned before that the lack of this ability to sit in the in-between, the space between the world as it is and the world as it should be, often leads to burnout, activists individually and collectively, and there's a very high failure rate of intentional communities. So the diffusion graph that I show here shows not only the high failure rate, but it also shows that despite, I visited hundreds of intentional communities. I've stayed for periods of time, only just a small proportion, but I've visited a lot. They're inspiring places. You come away thinking, wow, this is the answer to the world's problems. But the theories of diffusion show that there's a massive gap between the early adoption population, this tiny, it's actually shown as probably like 2.5% or something. But I was just reflecting on this, thinking, isn't it interesting that back in the days of Occupy Wall Street, the Occupy there was saying, we are the 99% against the 1% elite. Diffusion show the pioneering of utopian change makers, the people for whom the potential for transformation and radically changing the structures of inequality rests with, are 1%, not 99%. So there's a real paradox there in terms of how we can move out of this deadening weight of the dominant things like. So this kind of goes to show some of the incredible barriers to the growth of this model and why maybe there's a scale problem here. So the scope for intentional communities to inspire other early adopters functions in several ways. So they are physical spaces, they host visitors, and they can demonstrate a form of, a here and now actually existing alternative possible reality to capital patriarchy. But they're doing so in a way that's really still against the grain. So this is where I think pragmatic utopia comes up against utopian studies and utopian thinking, or some of the literature on utopian methods that I think can appear more promising and more transformative than it actually is in practice. Because there's often a sense of like we're looking backwards for inspiration, and it's true, we've got some incredible inspiration, enduring stories from history. We can cast back from a desirable future as prefigurative and futuristic scenario building is doing a lot in the environmental movement. A lot of prefigurative politics are saying we're horizon scanning for the technological sustainable future, and we're going to work back as to how we're going to achieve that. And there's a lot of efforts in terms of normalizing sustainable degrowth and solidarity through taking some of these experiments and kind of modeling how they could be developed at scale. But we seem to be stuck at a stage before it's possible to clearly demonstrate consistent success necessary to shift the dial on social and cultural norms. I'm thinking particularly in terms of property and the family. So little has changed in that it can be quite dispiriting and deadening. So as I'm drawing to a conclusion here, I suppose in a slightly more prosaic, sort of maybe mundane way, of taking what is inspirational about demonstration, intentional communities. I have explored some of the kind of people-powered place initiatives, a normalizing of some of the tools of conviviality in the everyday, where, for instance, there's placemaking efforts around street parties and happy to chat events and some of the social prescribing talked about earlier, the idea of normalizing people's connection to each other and to nature. Because Henry Lefebvre does argue that the texture of everyday social settings and interactions operate largely at an unconscious level. Maybe if we make this routine and habitual, that will be part of the tipping point in terms of this sociality. And it's useful to help uncover and value attributes and qualities of community glue in this. As I say, this what Ivan Illich talks about as the tools of conviviality. Interestingly, Illich talks about the tools as being spatial and temporal, because he also writes about reclaiming forms of idleness, because it's really important to have the time. It's shared spaces and social times. So as I draw to a conclusion, I want to emphasize that the black box qualities that bring people together, although largely discounted and overlooked, are not radical or futuristic. They are in the everyday, and feminists have known this for decades. My work in this field draws attention to the way people-powered initiatives experiment with the everyday politics of continuity and change to work creatively together. And for this, we need a much more expanded vocabulary and sensibility, and not to reach to the O2 cliched terms like social capital. We need to think about how people actually do get beyond individual intentions and action to think about collective agency and working together as groups. So my conclusions are that we've got to critically start from shifting from thinking about the individual and always having a language that talks about individual preferences or individual choices or individual action to collective agency and how people do operate as groups. We think about the anthropologists, in terms of sort of like thinking more about the scale of the village, the hamlet, the tribe, the group. And there are three main challenges to constructing collective actors and organising around them. The first is overcoming privatised lives. We live in little silos, and that's actually not so much only the physical, we also in social media, the idea that people actually only interact with the ideas of a handful, a dozen or so, in echo chambers. So we have to overcome privatised lives. We need to build relationships and trust across those bubbles and divides and small huddles of couples and families and extended kin groups. We need to build democratic alliances in common across fragmented social structures. And we need new tools and spaces and places to do that. And we need to nurture both task and maintenance functions of groups and alliances. We need to strategize and organize to win change. And bringing this up to the current moment, I was just reading a piece by Rebecca Solnit about the US elections, and she reminds us post-US election, the fact that we cannot save everything via the ballot box does not mean we cannot save anything, and everything we can save is worth saving. Don't mourn, organise and resist by building solidarity and sanctuary. Now, she wasn't talking about utopian practice, she wasn't talking about utopian theory. She's very pragmatic and on the ground, but I would say that that sits very comfortably in terms of the challenge for Utopianism, and that is to be relevant and to be here and now in the everyday, and to make that not yet, the yet of that to be a possibility, not some kind of distant dream. So I have an emphasis on the pragmatism of negotiated intentionality in the between, because I prefer that to the not yet, highlights a theory and a method of change. And again, just to return to the seminal text I've been working with a bit recently, is that this aligns with Bargiva and Lucy talking about practical radicals, their strategies to change the world. Starting with a pragmatic approach creates a plan of action and encourages us to think about how change happens. And I suppose I'm concluding here by saying that I've been trying to align utopian thinking with a theory of change. So I'm naturally kind of almost bringing change absolutely up front and central into the idea of utopianism. And utopianism is often thought about, the possibility of hope, but I think it's also got to be the possibility for real and effective change for there to be hope and possibility there in the first place. And I'll stop at that point. Thanks.